testing, 1, 2, testing. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. This morning I have the pleasure to introduce to you the mayor of Nashville. Carl Dean is the 6th mayor of the Metropolitan Government of Nashville and Davidson County. He was first elected on September the 11th in 2007 and re-elected on August the 4th, 2011. His priorities in the city have been improving schools, making neighborhoods safer, and bringing more and, of course, better jobs to the great city of Nashville. He has also worked to sustain and improve Nashville's high quality of life through numerous initiatives to promote health and volunteerism in the city of Nashville as well. Mayor Dean loves to read, and he promotes literacy all across the city for youth and adults across the city as well. Please join me in welcoming Nashville's mayor, the best mayor, Mayor Carl Dean.
Well, thank you, Dr. Woodard, for that kind introduction, and thank you to Maplewood for hosting this event today. It is great to be here in the Panther Nation. Today's going to be really interesting. You know, for nearly 10 years, Humanities Tennessee has been bringing authors to schools for unique presentations and to encourage connections between readers and authors. So I want to thank Humanities Tennessee for organizing today's event in partnership with our citywide reading program called Nashville Reads. Nashville Reads is a way of bringing the entire city together to read great literature. The program is a partnership between my office, the Nashville Public Libraries, Parnassus Books, Humanities Tennessee, and the Nashville Public Library Foundation. Events like this reinforce the importance of literacy and, in a young person's life, the importance of reading. When I was your age, I was reading books all the time. I loved reading. I still love to read. I'm a big champion, I hope you know, of mass transit. I have one of the great things about riding the bus to work in the morning is you get to read. And from my point of view is when you're reading on the bus, you get to read what you want to read. So I'm reading usually for pleasure. When I was growing up, one of the favorite parts of the city to me, I grew up in a small town, was our library. To me, it was the place where you could dream, where you could look, you could have access to all sorts of information, all sorts of books, and I've tried to work hard to make that possible for all the students here in Nashville. I'm particularly proud of our Limitless Library program, which allows individuals in schools to have access to all of the books in our public library system. That is a program that is unique in the country, and it is something that I am very proud of. If you do not have a library card, you can sign up in your school library for a citywide library card. When you get a library card, you can check out books, you can check out CDs, you can check out DVDs from any library in our city through your school library if you have that card. And that item will be directly delivered to your school. Today, we're going to talk about our Nashville Read book, We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, by Karen Joy Fowler. Karen Joy Fowler is the author of 6 novels and 3 short story collections. Her novel, The Jane Austen Book Club, spent 13 weeks on the New York Times bestsellers list and was a New York Times notable book. Ms. Fowler's previous novel, Sister Noon, was a finalist for the 2001 Penn Faulkner Award for Fiction. Her debut novel, Sarah Canary, was a New York Times notable book, as was her second novel, Sweetheart Season. Her latest novel, We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, is a great fit for our citywide read. It appeals to a wide range of readers and sparks connections and discussions. It's a novel that is both humorous and tragic. I came to this book because I was reading a book review in the New York Times. It was a front page book review, and it begins with the author who was writing the book review telling the reader, this is a great book, but if you really want to appreciate the book, don't read the cover of the book, don't read the summary in the front, and don't read the rest of the review. And so I put down the book review and went out and bought the book. and it was fantastic. It was one of those books where I started reading it and I couldn't put it down, and I finished it in about 2 days. Readers across this city have shared with me different ways in which this story of a fictional family and their unique circumstances allows readers to examine their own values and beliefs about family, science, animal rights, and other related themes. I hope that you have a chance to read this book and enjoy this novel as much as I did. I highly, highly recommend it, and I'm eager for you all to have an opportunity to hear our guest today. So please give a great Nashville welcoming to Karen Joy Fowler.
Shorter than the people in front of me. Thank you, Mayor Dean. Thank you, Principal Woodard. Thank you all for being here. This is actually my first school assembly, so I will remember you forever, one way or another. I want to talk to you a little bit today about my life as a writer, and then a little bit about the book as well. When I was in high school, which was now quite some time ago, I did think that I would be a writer. It was my original plan. And I was in charge of the creative writing magazine at the school, and met my first writer, my first real writer, a mystery writer named Agatha Christie. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but she was a sensationally, spectacularly successful writer who lived in England and wrote endless series of mysteries. A lot of her characters, Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot, have been in television shows and in movies. And this would have been about 1964, when I was about 14 years old, and she was already spectacularly successful. Her husband was an archaeologist, and I lived in Palo Alto, California, and he came to Stanford University to do a slideshow event on an archaeological dig that he was involved in. And it was open to the public, and I went because I hoped his wife would be there. I hoped to lay eyes on Agatha Christie. And I did. She was in the front row. She did not disappoint in any way. She was an elderly woman then, quite florid in complexion, and wearing an enormous mink coat, and also equally enormous bright pink bedroom slippers. And I think I thought to myself, a job where you get to wear your bedroom slippers when you go out sounds like a pretty good job to me. Few writers are as successful as Agatha Christie, so I cannot claim to have equaled her in any way in terms of number of books written, in terms of number of books sold, but I do have the bedroom slippers part down. And one of the things that I do like about my job is how little of a dress requirement there is. After high school, I, for reasons I can no longer remember, really lost track of my desire to be a writer. I went to college, I had kids. I didn't think about it again until my 30th birthday. And on my 30th birthday, because 30 seemed very old to me, very, very much like the good parts of my life were in the past now. Something I can assure you was not the case, but seemed like it must be the case when I turned 30. I started asking myself what it was I really wanted, out of my life, and remembered that what I really wanted was to be a writer. I think that I believed I could be a writer because I had read books all my life, because I had loved books all my life, and because so many people do write books. I thought to myself, how hard can it be? if so many people can do it. Turned out to be harder than I had anticipated, but obviously doable in the end. The thing that I had to do, the sort of very first hurdle that I feel I had to overcome, and which was all part of the initial conversation I had with myself on my 30th birthday, was to sort of face failure. When I looked at my life from 30, I saw a kind of pattern that had been in place for a long time. And in this pattern, I actually am kind of a quick study. I pick things up, I pick new things up fairly quickly. But I'm not a hardworking person. And so you put those two things together, and this is kind of the way I had managed my life. I would get interested in something new, I would pick it up, I would start to do it. It might be learning to play the guitar, it might be trying to learn to speak French, it might be anything. But initially I would be very good at it. I would be better than people expected, given that I had never done it before. But then, as everybody else in the class would actually practice and do the homework and do the work involved, and I would not, I would become less good at it. I would no longer be one of the best in the class. I would be sort of in the middle of the class, and then I would be sort of at the bottom of the class. And then at a point where I could begin to work, I would not. I would instead think of something new to go and do, again, where I could sort of briefly be admired. And I saw that I had just done that over and over and over again for 30 years. And I always thought that I did that because I was lazy. And I am not, as I have said, a very hardworking person, so that was an easy mistake to make. But when I looked more closely at my life, I realized I was also just terrified of failing, and that as long as I never tried really hard, as long as I never worked really hard, my failure was, first of all, guaranteed, but secondly, in some way, not my fault, not as embarrassing as if I had really tried and not been able to do it. And when I decided to be a writer, I saw that that model was not going to get me anywhere, that I was going to have to, in order to be a writer, I was going to have to try really hard. I was going to have to work really hard. I was going to have to persist for a long time. And that it was very, very possible that I would do all of those things and still not succeed in any way, that was a definite possibility. And I had to be okay with that before I could even start. So I always say that sort of the first thing I did as a writer was to face complete and utter failure, years of failure. But at 30, I had kind of finally come to a point in my life where I thought it would be better to look back at a life where I had really tried and failed at something than to look back at a life where I had never really tried. I joined a public workshop. I had not, as I said, after high school, I had completely lost track of that ambition. I had never taken a creative writing course. I didn't know any writers. I live in California, which is the opposite side of the country from where publishing is, so I knew very little about what being a writer would involve. I just knew that I loved books and that I wanted to be part of that world. I think that I learned most of what I learned as a writer in that public workshop, and it worked this way. Everybody would bring in whatever they had written during the week. You would read it aloud while everybody listened, which was a truly terrifying thing to do. And then after a long pause, people would begin to tell you what they thought of what you had brought in. Generally, it would not be good. Generally, you would have disappointed them in many, many ways you did not anticipate. And you would go home and either work on that again or write something new and rinse and repeat and rinse and repeat. And the way I thought that workshop would work turned out to be opposite to the way that I think it actually worked. I thought that the important part of the workshop would be the part where people told me what they thought of my work. And that when I talked to them about their work, that would just be me paying them back for the time and attention they had given me. But I think in retrospect, that it was the time and attention that I spent on their work where I actually learned whatever it is I now know about being a writer. It took longer than I hoped. It took me 5 years to get my first story published. And during that time, I did, as I had planned, work very hard and fail a great deal. I have more than 200 rejection slips, and one of the things I learned is that I was a tougher person than I had imagined I would be, because of all of the people who were in that writing workshop with me, I think that I was not the most talented. I know I was not the hardest working, and I know that I was not the person to whom it mattered the most. I just turned out to be the only person who could be rejected so many times and not get the message that maybe I was not going to be able to make this work. I sold my first novel about 9 years in. And I have now been writing for 34 years, and I would say that I have only been able to make a living at it for the last 10, maybe. So it's not a job that you go into because of the financial rewards, which are very unpredictable and in many ways very unlikely. And at the very least, very intermittent, so that you may get a big paycheck and then years pass where you get no money at all. But, so hopefully you have a day job, something else that provides you with health care and life's necessities. And in my lucky situation was to be married to somebody who had all of those things and provided the family with health care, which hopefully is not going to be the problem for all of us that it has been in the past, but was when I started working. As Mayor Dean told you, I have now published 6 novels. I have 3 collections of short stories, and another thing that I think served me well, as opposed to some of the other people I met along the way who also wanted to be writers, along with my toughness, was that I just wanted to be a writer. I knew a lot of writers who wanted to be writers because they had particular stories they wanted to tell. They had a story they wanted to tell, generally their story. And a lot of writers are very autobiographical and write wonderful books out of the experiences they have had and the way that they see the world. But my impulse has always been the other one, that I want to write books because I like to imagine what it would be like not to be me, to be somebody who had completely different experiences and a completely different life. And I sometimes think this distinction is not as clear as I'm making it sound, because I do use a lot of autobiographical material, and that will become clear when I talk about my book, We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves. But my initial impulse is an outward one, is to try to think about what the world looks like to somebody who's not me, and what kinds of experiences would make a person different from me. The premise for We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves is so preposterous that if it weren't true, I would never have dreamt of writing the book. And now I'm going to get a little into my autobiography. My father was a psychologist, but whatever picture that brings to your mind, he was not that kind of psychologist. My father worked with animals. He was an animal behaviorist, and he worked in particular with rats. He ran rats through mazes, and he studied learning behavior. And eventually, he went on from that experience and that research to create a system for teaching mathematics in the schools, which in California, where we lived back then, and where I still live, was called New Math, and which I have to say has not been a tremendous success, was attempted and abandoned in fairly short order. But I just grew up around psychologists. I spent a lot of time as a child in the rat lab, which was a surprisingly magical place. I always feel that there can be few people in the world who get the same nostalgic hit of the smell of rat cages that I do. But I was often allowed to take the rats out when they were not busy running the mazes. I could play with them, and it was just a great place as a kid to be able to go and see my father at work. There was a part of the lab that I was not allowed in, and that was where the monkey cages were. Simultaneously to the rat experiments, there were experiments being done on rhesus monkeys. And the experiments, in retrospect, were really too dreadful to even talk to you about today. But it was very clear when you saw the monkeys in their cages that they had been tormented in some terrible way. And you could not go anywhere near them because they would reach out and try to grab you as you went by, and they would bite you if they could. And they were clearly miserable animals. And I think that I have spent my whole life haunted by those miserable monkeys in those cages. So the premise for my book, and as Mayor Dean told you, you're actually not supposed to know this when the book starts, so I do apologize for the fact that I'm about to spoil my own surprise for you. But the premise of the book is based on an experiment that was done in the 1930s, in which a psychologist named Winthrop Kellogg raised his infant son Donald side by side with an infant chimpanzee named Gua. And the experiment lasted about 19 months. And the idea was that if you gave an infant chimpanzee and an infant human being very, very similar upbringings, if you tried to standardize the way that they were raised and the way that they were treated, then you would learn something about what the actual innate differences between humans and chimpanzees were. They were very focused on Gua, and they were very focused on language. Sort of what language would a chimpanzee who was raised as a human child be capable of? I had heard about this experiment all of my life. The results of it were that an infant chimpanzee will perform better than a human child at almost everything, including language, for about 16 to 19 months. And then the child who will never match the chimp for sort of physical abilities will begin to make up ground in terms of language and other more cognitive areas. I was telling my daughter about this experiment one night for reasons that I no longer remember. And she's the one who suggested the book to me. She said, wow, what would it be like to be the child whose father thought that was an appropriate way to bring you up? You should write a book about that child. So that is what I've done. My book is about a child who was raised in this way. I moved the actual experiment from the 1930s to the 1970s. And I made it last a great deal longer. The original experiment ended for reasons that apparently nobody anticipated, but which now seem pretty obviously possible, which is that the infant brain in chimpanzees as well as humans is very, very flexible, very malleable, and takes in a great deal from whomever you are spending the majority of your time with. And therefore, not only did Gua pick up human behaviors, as was expected, but Donald picked up chimp behaviors. And apparently one morning, Mrs. Kellogg put Donald's breakfast in front of him, and he responded with the excited chimpanzee food hoot, which goes something like, hoo, hoo, hoo. And Mrs. Kellogg said, right, that's the end of that experiment. And Gua was sent back to the research lab, and Donald was sent back into the world of the human beings. In my book, the experiment has profound implications for the family, and particularly for the child, who in my book is, my narrator is 40 years old, is looking back on her life, on an experiment that ended when she was 5, and trying to determine what exactly it has meant for her to have been twinned with a chimp. I did a great deal of research for the book, which I am asking neither to be pitied for nor praised for, because I like doing the research, and I learned an enormous amount about animal cognition, which is a very fast-moving field, and I think a very incredible one. I will tell you just a couple of the more incredible things that I learned when I was researching the book, which come from the studies currently being done on animal communication. And I was recently reading about prairie dogs. Some researchers who study the calls that prairie dogs do have discovered that they have various alarm calls, so that when a threat is approaching, one individual will sound a sort of alarm for the rest, which is a very selfless thing to do. Obviously, you draw attention to yourself if you stand up and make noise when something threatening is coming. But one member always does that, and as they have analyzed the calls, they have discovered that the amount of information contained in them is pretty incredible, so that not only do prairie dogs alert each other if the threat is coming from the sky or from the ground, which a lot of animals do, but also if it is coming from the ground. If it is a person approaching the prairie dog signal will tell the other prairie dogs how large the person is, what color shirt the person is wearing, and if the person is carrying a gun or not. So all of that is contained in the alarm calls that the prairie dogs send out to each other. And I'm just offering that as one example of the ways in which animals think and behave are always seem to be more complicated than we imagined, and that the animals that we share the planet with appear to have we appear to have underestimated them at almost every point. Crows have incredible facial recognition skills. I read a while back that there was a plan, never implemented, but discussed, to send crows out to look for Osama bin Laden. That, if you can show a crow a face, a crow can find that face. And we'll remember that face. There's a very famous experiment that took place in Seattle at the University of Washington, where a group of researchers were capturing crows and banding them because they wanted to track their movements. And so they put little transistors on their legs. But the crows obviously did not enjoy the experience of being captured and abandoned, and they remembered the people who had done that to them. And these researchers soon became unable to go onto campus. They would be mobbed by crows, and this happened even after they graduated. If they came back years later, the crows still remembered. And as a result, the people involved in crow research now at the University of Washington have to wear enormous clown wigs and masks so that the crows will not be able to identify them years later as the horrible, horrible people who captured them and banded them. When I started doing the research, the home raising of chimpanzees was not as unusual as you might imagine. The Kellogg experiment is the only one I know of where there was an infant in the home at the same time where they were trying to raise the two simultaneously. But there are a lot of experiments in which the chimpanzees were home raised, and often with older children already in the house. So there was actually a great deal of information about what those experiments were like, what it would be like to have a chimpanzee in the home, what chimpanzees could and couldn't do, what they might do. But there was nothing that I could find about the children who were in the home at the same time. That part I had to make up, which is obviously what a novelist does. So I just tried to imagine what it would be like to have been raised with a chimpanzee, what sort of a person you might be at the end of 5 years of that, and go forward from there. One of the interesting things that has happened to me since the book has been published is that I have started to hear from adults now, but people who were children in homes that contain chimpanzees. And so that's been fascinating, and obviously it would have been so very useful to have that information when I was writing the book, and not after I had published it. But it does seem to be a pretty profound experience. One of the first people I heard from is a daughter in the Kellogg family, where the original experiment took place. And she was not born at the time of the experiment. She was born a year later. So the chimp was no longer in the house when she came in. But I have had 3 letters from her, and she does feel very strongly that the experiment destroyed her family. It's not clear to me from her letters whether it was actually the experiment that destroyed her family or the fact that she had a father who would conduct such an experiment that destroyed the family. But it's, as I said, this is something that happened before she was born, and she still feels that her life has been utterly marked by it, and is obviously, she must be in her 80s now, still very, very angry about it. Another thing my book is looking at, along with this experiment, is the issue of memory. Because my protagonist was only 5 years old when the experiment finished, I had to think a lot about what at 40 years old you might remember about being 4 and about being 5. And one of the revolutions that I have lived through is our feelings about our own memories and the reliability of our own memories. In the 1970s, when child abuse became a very public and prominent issue, this aspect of the reliability of memory was a large part of it, that we have learned in the intervening years that it is very, very easy for you to redo your own memories, to create a sort of story for yourself that may or may not be true, but that you will believe is the way things happened. And it is also extremely easy for somebody else to plant in you a memory of something that never actually happened to you, but that you believe happened to you because you have been told it happened to you. And this, as I said, this is a revolution I've lived through. It was a shocking one as it went on, because I think prior to this research, we did trust our memories. We did think we were on solid ground. A number of people have been sent to jail based on eyewitness accounts of things that happened. And we now know that eyewitness accounts are also extremely unreliable and extremely open to tampering of that same sort. So at least one early reader told me that she thought it was, it introduced a complication into an already complicated story, that my protagonist knows that her memories are not the most reliable source about the things that happened in the household when she was 5. And that although she shares her memories with the reader, she also tells the reader that they are not necessarily to be trusted. But I could not think of a plausible way to do it otherwise. It seemed to me that the book would not be believable if I suggested that the memories we have from being 4 and 5 are more reliable than I know that they are. I suspect everybody who has ever shared memories with their family has had the experience that I have had on multiple occasions, where you tell some story that you remember only to have your family correct you and, you know, say, well, of course, we weren't in Indiana when that happened, we were in California. And somebody else will say, you know, I believe it was winter, I don't think it was spring. And somebody else will say, and that happened to me, not you, so I don't know why you remember it. This, again, is something that the novel attempts to look at, the sort of ways in which we shape our own memories for good or for ill, and what happens when we try to get a more accurate account by running it by other people who also remember the same things but remember them quite differently. A final thread in the book is about language, and the natural sciences have for quite some time seen a clear continuum between animals and people that the arts and humanities have been slower to pick up on, that the arts and humanities are still very focused on human exceptionalism and still very focused on what makes us different from other animals and what our special capabilities are. It now appears that we are always looking for that explanation. What is a human being? Why is a human being different from other animals? And we are always proposing different possibilities, and those possibilities do not seem to last very long, that we almost always find somewhere in the animal kingdom some creature that has that same ability. So again, I have lived through a period when I went to grammar school, human beings were considered to be the tool-using animals. But now we know that many creatures use tools, and you can go see them for yourself on YouTube. There are many available videos of crows sledding down roofs and making fish hooks for themselves, and of chimpanzees making cups to drink water out of, and all sorts of things. And so the tool using having fallen to the wayside, sort of where we've been for the past several years has been language, that there's something special about the way humans use language that is not found in the rest of the animal kingdom. Again, as we have studied animal communication more closely, that one seems to be falling away as well. So it appears that the difference between people and the other animals is going to be more of a dotted line than a kind of bright and clear dividing point. I just finished reading a book by France Duval, who's one of our premier researchers in this area, and he's done an experiment on using capuchin monkeys, which again is available on YouTube. It's a very famous experiment now, because it's quite pleasurable to watch. And what happens in the experiment is that two monkeys are given an identical task, but they are given unidentical rewards. So they're in side-by-side cages, they can see each other, they're doing the same things, but one of them is being given cucumber slices, and one of them is being given grapes as a result. And apparently grapes are a much more desirable food than cucumber slices. And the one that is getting cucumber slices begins to throw the cucumber slices at the researcher with all the force they can manage. Their utter disgust at being treated so shabbily when the monkey next door is being treated so well. France Duval calls this first order fairness, which he uses to suggest that all primates have a sense of what is fair and what is not. and that all of our morality arises from these primate instincts, and again, is something that we share. So again, something that is not a dividing line between us and the rest of the animals is an innate sense of what is fair, and an innate sense of what is just, and an innate sense of how we ought to be treated and how we ought to treat other people. Empathy is, as it turns out, a very natural part of our makeup, which is a good thing to know. So many of the things we see about us when we look around the world suggest that empathy is not something front and foremost in the human experience. The book, as I said, is, I've talked a lot about animals because those issues do come up in the book, but the book really is about the girl and what it is like to be different, what it is like to have had a very different upbringing, and as I said, is my best attempt to imagine what this very peculiar start in life would result in. Parts of the book, I hope, are very funny. I intend them to be very funny. I was sometimes laughing so hard myself I could hardly type my own funniness. And parts of the book are not funny at all. And that's basically what I have. I would love to take some questions if you have some questions, either about the book, about anything I've talked about, or just about being a writer in general. Anybody? I can stand here as long as it takes. Yes?
Okay, it says, how does postmodernism and the evolution of language factor into your writing?
I did not study literature in college, and so words like postmodernism, which I hear a great deal, I am not entirely certain what they mean. So I will answer that question for what that word means to me, which may not be what it means at all. I caution you with that. But I do bring a lot of other texts into the books that I write. I was a reader long before I was a writer, and so I bring bits and pieces of my reading into everything that I do. In this particular book, for example, there's some discussion of Tarzan. Tarzan would be, the flip side of the story that I am telling, not the chimp raised by humans, but the human raised by chimps. And therefore, it seemed to me relevant and also, just something that I enjoy. There's also a lot of Star Wars in the book, just because it takes place in the 1970s, and that was very much part of the childhood experience then. So there's an older brother in the book, and he has been to Star Wars, and it allows me to finally say something about Star Wars that has troubled me for years and years and years, which is at the end of the first movie, there's a big awards ceremony, and Han Solo gets a medal, and Luke Skywalker gets a medal, and Chewbacca gets no medal. It has always bothered me enormously that there's no medal for Chewbacca. I don't understand it. I don't think it's fair. I think the movie should be recut as a result, and this lapse in taste and judgment should be fixed. But I guess if we want George Lucas to fix all his lapses in taste and judgment, that would be a lifetime's job. To me, postmodernism is often me responding in my work to other work. And I find that a very energizing thing to do. I frequently am unhappy about one thing or another when I watch a movie or I see a television show or I read a book. My children do not like to go to the movies with me. I have so many complaints. I think that it adds to the experience, but apparently not. So, books allow me to express my irritation. And hopefully someone will write a book expressing their irritation with me as well. That would be a level of achievement I would be honored to receive. There was somebody else in this area. Yes, thank you.
The stream of consciousness played an important role in the approach of characterization in your books.
I can't hear you. Say it a little louder.
The stream of consciousness played an important role in your approach to characterization.
This is the first book I've done in a while that had a first-person narrator, which means that we're in her head a lot, and so we see all of the things that she is thinking and all of her plans and hopes and disappointments. And so in this book, yes, often I use what's called an omniscient narrator, which means that somebody who's not in the story is sort of standing outside telling the story. And in that case, I'm not so much in the heads of the characters and not using stream of consciousness in that same way. Yes?
How does vocabulary study factor into your writing?
How does vocabulary?
Study factor into your writing.
Well, that's a pertinent question to this book as well, and not so much to my other books. But for this book, because my narrator was part of this study, because she spent the first 5 years sort of compared to a chimp, and because the only area in which she would have emerged absolutely triumphant would be language. She has focused very much on language, and she has a pretty preposterous vocabulary. In point of fact, many people have told me that they had to go to the dictionary quite often while reading this book, and so did I. I did not, this is the way she talks is not part of my natural vocabulary. What I did was, I got a textbook that helps people study for the GREs, the test you take after college to get into grad school, and looked at the vocabulary list there and picked out the words I did not know and learned them so that my protagonist could know them. So there are, you're frequently told as a writer that you should never use a $100 word when a $3 word will do, that your vocabulary should be kept simple and natural. And I do in general believe that, but it was a lot of fun in this one book and instance to write with using all the $100 words, even the ones I had to learn in order to use them. There was someone in the back, yes. Again, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
What universal thing does this novel communicate to the reader? What is the moral of the story?
What is the moral of the story? Again, I think the moral for me, the reason I wrote the book in the first place was that I felt that I felt concerned about the way chimps were being used in research experiments. I felt that everything we had learned about chimpanzees made it clear that they are so much like us, that we share something like 96% of our DNA, and that it was therefore just unconscionable to be using them in the ways that that science and the movies, the entertainment industries, and the circuses were using them. They were too human-like to be put through the things that they were being put through. As I went deeper into the book and I started looking at other animals and other animal cognition, I sort of broadened my perspective and asked myself why the thing that made me sympathetic had to be being like me. That, why I couldn't feel that same way about animals that were less human-like. Didn't they also deserve good treatment and fair treatment? And so I sort of saw my own shortcomings in the process of writing the book. But that would be my take-home message, just that, as I've said, that we've underestimated the animals that we share the planet with, and that I think that what I feel most strongly is that we should not do things that we cannot bear to look at. And this, involves our prisons, it involves our wars, and it certainly involves the way food is produced in this country. That if you're not able to bear the way animals being raised for food are treated, then the way our society has dealt with it is by making it possible for you not to look. And that I hope my book will make it more likely that that people will think about these things and we'll find a different solution. We'll find a way to do these things that we can look at instead of choosing just not to look. Yes?
As a writer, was it challenging for you to finish it, like writing with the emotions and portraying something that you not for yourself lived, but you tried to experience it through your words?
It's always challenging. It's also fun, it's the part that I like, but I do think that in this book, because I have a chimp character and I have never been around chimps, I did not know much about chimps when I started, that I didn't have the confidence to make up that character, that I did a lot of reading, as I said, about the home-raised chimps, and so there's nothing that my chimp character does in my book that I haven't read an account of a chimp doing somewhere. But I don't feel that way about the humans. I feel I know what it's like to be human. I can make things up, and honestly, there's nothing I can imagine that someone somewhere hasn't done. So I feel more confident and freer to imagine what a person might be like. And the way I create characters, I like to start with a story that someone has told me. I'm running out of time, so I'll tell you this one just really quickly, but as an example of the way I would start to think about a character. My cousin told me a story a long time ago about a girl who went to her high school, and on prom night, she borrowed the family car and she went and picked up her date. They lived in Ventura, California, which is on the ocean. And they went to the dance and then they left the dance and she drove the car out onto the beach. And they occupied themselves in the car in some way that took all of their attention. And the next thing they knew, the car was kind of rocking. And they looked out and the tide had come in. And they had to flee the car in their prom finery and then stand and watch while the car was dragged out to sea, and then had to go call her parents and explain that she had lost the family car. And this is somebody I will never meet, but the appeal of the story is obvious. So I would start thinking, what kind of a person? What kind of a person would this be? What kind of a person would this happen to? And so I start from a story that somebody tells me, and then I make up the person in the story. And then having made up the person in that story, I write a different story, but I use that person. I did initially frequently use people that I knew in stories, but let me caution you that rarely turns out well. They recognize themselves, or they don't. They recognize themselves in some character that had nothing to do with them, and they're cross at you because of something you said, and you can never persuade them that you didn't mean it, or you thought it was a compliment, or you thought they'd be pleased. It just never ends well. So I don't use the people in my life anymore. Although you can, I have discovered, you can say that you can accuse somebody of many terrible things if you also describe them in the book as eerily beautiful, you know, extremely sexy. Then they will overlook the fact that you have also said that they're liars and cheats and not to be trusted. So if you must use someone you know in your work, that's my recommendation. Make them very, very, very beautiful. Are we done? It is 9. Thank you very much.
Let's have one more hand for Miss Karen Joy Flowers. Guys, I want you to know that it's not every day that you have a New York Times best-selling author come to your high school. And I don't know if she mentioned this or not, but this is the very first high school she's ever been at. So you have a New York Times best-selling author, and her first high school ever was Maplewood High School.